8 miles of pavement in the Black Mountains of western Arizona contain 191 curves, no guardrails, no shoulders wide enough to matter. Locals call it the Sidewinder, and you will still see the rusted shapes of cars that did not make the turn. This is Route 66, not the version with the milkshakes and the neon signs, the other one. You already know the postcard version of this road. 2,448 miles of blacktop running from Chicago to Santa Monica, 8 states, one long ribbon of Americana that Hollywood has been selling you since the 1940s. What most people never hear is the name truckers, state troopers, and small-town coroners gave it instead. They called it Bloody 66. And before we get into why, if you have ever driven a stretch of this road yourself, or you are watching this from one of the 8 states it passes through, drop it in the comments below and go ahead and subscribe, because we are about to explain exactly what made America's most famous highway one of its deadliest. Now, back to the road. Route 66 was commissioned on November 11, 1926, stitched together out of existing state and county roads rather than built new from the ground up. That decision, made for speed and came after, is the root of almost everything that came after. The route itself was chosen for a practical reason. It offered the shortest year-round path between the industrial Midwest and the Pacific coast, avoiding the heaviest snow of the northern routes and the worst of the southern desert's summer extremes. But shortest does not mean safest. Threading a single highway diagonally across 8 states meant inheriting whatever road already existed in each county, connecting Illinois farm-to-market lanes to Ozark mining roads to New Mexico wagon trails to century-old Arizona mining routes, with almost no unified engineering standard tying any of it together. A driver crossing a single state line could go from smooth new pavement to a rutted dirt tracks of a few hundred feet, with no warning sign to with no warning sign to prepare them for the change. When the highway was signed into existence, only about 800 of its 448 miles were paved. The rest was graded dirt, gravel, brick, or, in a few stretches, wooden planks laid over swampy ground. It took 11 more years until 1937 before the entire route was finally paved from end to end. For over a decade, drivers navigating between Chicago and Los Angeles were doing it on a patchwork of surfaces, sometimes county line to county line, and the road itself was narrow. In central Illinois, sections of the original 1920s pavement measured only 18 to 20 feet wide, barely enough for 2 cars to pass each other, let alone a car and a hay wagon, which, in the road's early decades, it frequently had to. Speed limits in that era hovered around 25 miles per hour, not because engineers were being cautious, but because the road was built for a world that still had horse-drawn traffic sharing the right-of-way with the first mass-produced automobiles. Summoned the still. Then, through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, car speeds climbed to 60 and even 80 miles per hour. The road did not get any wider. The bridges did not get any longer. The blind curves did not get any straighter. You had a 19th century right-of-way suddenly carrying 20th century speeds. And that mismatch is where the killing started. The cars themselves made a bad situation worse. Automobiles of the 1940s and 1950s were, by modern standards, dangerous machines even on a good road. Tires ran on inner tubes prone to sudden, catastrophic blowouts at highway speed. Early nylon ply tires wore bald quicklies, exactly the kind of failure most likely to happen on a hot desert highway under sustained load. Brakes faded long from Sitgreaves Pass, sometimes failing outright by the bottom of the grade. None of these vehicles had seatbelts as standard equipment until the 1960s, and none had anything resembling a crumple zone. Put a mechanically fragile car, driven at a speed the road was never designed for, onto a blind curve with a wooden guardrail and a 100-foot drop, and the outcome was rarely in doubt. Bridges, Missouri, and into the Mojave Desert. Many of the crossings built for Route 66 were only about 18 feet wide, just enough for the road itself, with wooden guardrails on either side and nothing underneath to catch a car that drifted wrong. Two vehicles approaching from opposite directions at speed, on a road with no center reflectors and headlights that, by modern standards, barely qualified as headlights, had almost no margin for error. When cars met on those narrow spans, they collided directly. Or one swerved and struck the wooden rail hard enough to be impaled on it. Tow truck operators along the route kept records of exactly this happening for decades. Then there was the terrain itself, which varied so violently along the route that no single set of driving instincts could carry you safely across all of it. In central Illinois and Missouri, the danger was flat, fast farm country full of blind intersections where county roads and railroad crossings met the highway at 90-degree angles, with nothing to slow a driver down before impact. In the Ozark foothills of Missouri, the danger flipped entirely. Switchback curves cut into mountainsides, steep grades, and in winter, ice on curves with no room to correct. In the Texas Panhandle, an 18-mile stretch of black clay soil near the ghost town of Jericho turned into a mud pit whenever it rained, swallowing cars up to their axles and stranding entire families until a local farmer with a team of mules could pull them free. And in western Arizona, the road climbed straight into the Black Mountains over a mountain pass so steep and blind that some drivers paid locals to drive their cars over it for them. That pass has a name: Sitgreaves Pass, part of what locals still call the Oatman Highway. It runs roughly 22 miles from the ghost town of Oatman up over the summit and down the other side, narrow, blind, with drop-offs of hundreds of feet in places, marked in the 1930s and 1940s by nothing more than a few wooden fence posts strung with chain. It earned the nickname Bloody 66 on its own, independent of the rest of the highway, sometime in the 1950s, and the 8-mile section locals call that reputation today. This is mechanism, not mythology. The road kills because of geometry. Sharp grades steep enough to burn out brakes taken at speed, steep enough to burn out brakes on the way down, on a surface with no room for a mistake. World War II made all of this worse before it made it better. Route 66 became one of the most heavily used highways in the country almost overnight, carrying military convoys, equipment, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers moving between training bases and coastal ports. Near Fort Leonard Wood in central Missouri, the surge was staggering. In a single 9-month period in 1941, that stretch of highway recorded 454 accidents. 54 people died, including 19 American soldiers, between January and September of that year alone. This was a road built for Model Ts, absorbing military-grade truck traffic it was never engineered to handle. And the human cost showed up almost immediately in the accident logs. The nickname followed the road west. In Illinois, state police patrolled the stretch between Dwight and McLean specifically because of its reputation, and a rough patch north of Pontiac earned its own grim title, Dead Man's Alley. Officers who worked that beat for decades later recalled that most of the fatal wrecks happened at intersections with county roads or railroad crossings, exactly the blind, unmarked junctions the old alignment was full of. Near Towanda, Illinois, a sudden 90-degree bend became so notorious for wrecks that it was simply called Dead Man's Curve, a name so fitting that a nearly identical stretch 2,000 miles away, outside the New Mexico village of Mesita, earned the exact same nickname for the exact same reason. A blind curve wrapped around a sandstone cliff, hiding oncoming traffic until it was almost too late to New Mexico. The regional nicknames tell the same story from Texas to New Mexico. Near Groom, Texas, on flat, seemingly harmless prairie, a stretch of the highway became known locally as Death Alley and Blood Alley. Further west, the stretch running from Glen Rio, New Mexico, picked up its own name, Slaughter Lane. None of these names were coined by outsiders looking to sensationalize the road. They came from the people who lived alongside it, who pulled the wrecked cars out, and who buried some of the people inside them. By the early 1950s, the pattern was well enough established that newspapers were reporting it as fact, not folklore. In 1953, the Gallup Independent, covering the New Mexico stretch of the highway, called Route 66 the state's most dangerous highway after 110 people were killed on the road in New Mexico in just the first 4 months of that year. In Arizona, over the same post-war period, researchers found that roughly 1 in every 7 traffic accidents recorded in the entire state happened somewhere along Route 66, a staggering concentration for a single highway. One especially bad stretch was Ash Fork Hill, west of Flagstaff, a steep grade that punished the brakes of underpowered post-war cars. Further west, near Peach Springs, Arizona, one especially bad month in 1959 saw 11 deaths on a single stretch of highway, Levin Vanastat, according to research compiled in the book Route 66 in Arizona. And in the Mojave Desert, the danger took on a different character entirely: heat, isolation, and mechanical failure. Buster Burris, who ran a garage and motel at Amboy, California, for decades after the war, kept a saw in his tow truck specifically to cut through the wooden guardrails that drivers had been thrown into or impaled on after losing control on the desert's narrow, unlit bridges. Route 66, in the years after the war, carried an estimated 200 million vehicles in total before its eventual retirement, and for a huge share of that traffic, the road had almost no safety margin built in, no shoulders, no reflective lane markings in the early decades, no breakdown lanes in the desert, where a mechanical failure in July heat could turn a flat tire into a medical emergency within hours. The road that carried Dust Bowl refugees west in the 1930s, that carried soldiers to war and back in the 1940s, and that carried a booming post-war America on its first road trips in the 1950s, was killing a measurable, documented number of the people who used it every single year for decades. Some of that danger has never fully gone away. It has just changed shape. On November 20, 2023, in Flagstaff, Arizona, 20-year-old Liana Scow was standing near an intersection on West Route 66 in the early evening when two vehicles collided and one of them struck her. She died at the scene. Her death had nothing to do with hairpin turns in the Black Mountains or muddy roads in the Texas Panhandle. It happened on an ordinary traffic of the old highway. A reminder that Route 66's danger was never only about its wildest, most remote stretches. Some of it was always about what happens when a two-lane road built for 1926 traffic patterns keeps carrying 21st century volume straight through the middle of a modern town. If you have made it this far, you have probably already guessed that the road's reputation did not end with the Golden Age. It changed, and in some ways, it is still being written today. Stick around, because the modern data on this people expect is frankly more specific than most people expect. And it tells you exactly which stretches to be careful on if you ever drive it yourself. And while you're here, subscribing genuinely helps a small channel like this one keep making these deep dives. So if you haven't already, now's a good time. Back to the road. Route 66 was officially decommissioned on June 27, 1985. Its final segment bypassed in Williams, Arizona, the last town on the route, to fight off the interstate that eventually replaced it. 5 different interstates absorbed its traffic over the following decades. Interstate 55 out of Chicago, Interstate 44, Interstate 4015, and finally Interstate 10 into Los Angeles. On paper, that should have been the end of the story. It was not. A data analysis published in 2026 by a personal injury law firm in National Injury of Fatal Albuquerque, drawing on 4 years of fatal crash records from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's fatality analysis reporting system, examined the entire modern Route 66 corridor, including the interstates and frontage roads that now carry the old alignment's traffic. Between 2021 and 2024, that corridor recorded 1,240 fatal crashes across all 8 states. Missouri, despite carrying only about 13% of the route's total mileage, recorded more fatal crashes than any other state along the corridor. New Mexico followed closely, with 272 fatal crashes over the same 4 years, and California came in third with 241. When researchers narrowed their focus specifically to rural stretches, away sections of the corridor stood out for their concentration of fatal wrecks. The worst of them sits west of Albuquerque, New Mexico, a 21-mile stretch running near the historic Rio Puerco Bridge, which recorded 18 fatal crashes and 25 deaths in just 4 years. This is the same general area as the old Dead Man's Curve near Mesita, the blind bend around a sandstone cliff that has been claiming vehicles since the 1920s. A second New Mexico stretch, 14 miles long near Thoreau, close to the Continental Divide, recorded 15 fatal crashes and 20 deaths in the same period. New Mexico alone contains 4 of the 8 most dangerous rural stretches identified in the entire analysis, more than any other state on the route. Missouri's most dangerous stretch runs 25 miles just west of Springfield, the city where the number 66 was officially chosen for the highway back in 1926. That section recorded 18 fatal crashes and 22 deaths. In California, a 17-mile stretch through Cajon Pass, where the road drops sharply between the San Bernardino and San Gabriel Mountains, recorded 16 fatal crashes and 18 deaths. That pass has been dangerous since the earliest cars tried to climb it. Drivers in the 1920s regularly overheated their engines going up, and some lost their brakes and rolled backward coming down. Today, the danger has shifted to high winds funneling through the narrow gap, strong enough to roll semi-trucks, which is why officials now actively monitor wind speeds there and issue warnings before conditions turn dangerous. And in Arizona, a 17-mile stretch of flat, straight highway west of Winslow, the town made famous by the Eagles song, recorded 12 fatal crashes and 14 deaths. Researchers noted that the road's very straightness may be part of the problem. Long, featureless stretches tend to lull drivers into inattention, right up until something forces a sudden reaction. It is worth pausing on why this matters right now, specifically. Route 66 is approaching its 100th anniversary in 2026, and towns along the corridor are already preparing for a sharp rise in visitors. Road trippers, motorcyclists, and international tourists flying in specifically to drive the mother road from end to end. More traffic on a corridor that already produced over 1,000 fatal crashes in a recent endful feat in 4 ordinary years is not a small detail. It is the exact kind of pattern that transportation planners use this sort of data to prepare for. Adding signage, lighting, and enforcement at the specific points where the numbers say people are already dying. The same analysis found a pattern in timing that cuts across every one of these locations. More than 40% of all fatal crashes along the Route 66 corridor between 2021 and 2024 occurred in a single 7-hour window between 5 in the evening and midnight. The single most dangerous hour by the data was 8 o'clock at night, accounting for nearly 7% of all fatal crashes on its own. Traffic is still heavy at that hour. Visibility has already dropped, and impaired driving becomes more common as the evening goes on. A highway built on the romance of the open road, driven today largely by tourists chasing nostalgia in rental cars and on motorcycles, is still, according to the numbers, at its most lethal after dark. What ties all of this together across a full century is not one single flaw. It is the same flaw appearing in different on the map. In the 1920s and 1930s, it was a road built too cheap and too fast for it eventually carried. In the 1940s, it was a two-lane highway absorbing wartime volumes it was never designed for. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was post-war cars getting faster while the road's geometry stayed exactly the same. And today, it is a fragmented patchwork corridor, part interstate, part frontage road, part preserved historic alignment, where drivers moving at modern highway speeds still encounter the same blind curves, the same narrow passes, and the same years ago. And the same isolated stretches that killed people 90 years ago. There is also a simpler explanation running underneath all of it, one that has nothing to do with engineering at all. Route 66 was, and still is, a road people drive for the feeling of it, not the efficiency of it. Nobody takes the old alignment through Sitgreaves Pass or the back roads past Devil's Elbow because it saves time. They take it because it is scenic, nostalgic, a little bit thrilling. That psychology cuts against caution. That a road that invites you to slow down and look at the view is also a road that invites your attention away from the pavement at exactly the moments a blind curve or a narrow bridge demands it most. Most of what made Route 66 lethal in its heyday has, to be fair, been engineered away. The road has been straightened in dozens of places. Bridges have been widened. Guardrails exist now where there were none. Devil's Elbow, Missouri, once one of the most feared bends on the entire route, with blind turns, steep drops, and icy winter grades above a river crossing, has been bypassed by safer modern construction. And today, it is a scenic detour rather than a genuine hazard. The overwhelming majority of people who drive Route 66 today, and there are a great many of them, especially with the highway's 100th anniversary, drawing renewed attention in 2026, do so without incident. Stopping for milkshakes in small towns and photographs beside vintage signs exactly the way the postcards promise. But the data does not lie, and neither does the history. This is still, in places, a road with the bones of a highway built for a different century, carrying traffic it was never fully redesigned to handle. The danger was never really about ghosts, or curses, or any of the folklore that tends to attach itself to old American roads. It was always about geometry, about speed outpacing engineering, about a road that grew nationally famous faster than it grew genuinely safe. Back where we started, in the Black Mountains west of Kingman, the road still climbs into Sitgreaves Pass exactly the way it did in the 1920s, narrow, blind, unforgiving of a moment's inattention. The rusted cars are still down there, past the wooden posts, past the chain that was never really strong enough to stop anything. Route 66 will let you drive it slowly and carefully, and remember why the interstates were built in the first place, or it will remind you, the way it has reminded a documented number of people for 100 years now, that a road this old was never as gentle as the postcards make it Look, if you have your own story from this highway, good or bad, leave it in the comments. Someone planning their own drive down the mother road is probably reading them.